We normally use arguments in the ideal or actual world as a way to resolve disputations between individuals or groups of individuals. It's viewed as an alternative to violence, and it's viewed as a way to uncover truths. Through the process of rigorous argument, what will tend to surface or what will be left behind will be the kernel of truth. And debate tends to do that in many levels, mainly because it forces us to read and to engage in a level of research that is probably more extensive than most people who aren't engaging in debate and argument. Also, through the process of summarizing, we end up developing some core ideas, and the core ideas then allow us to be able to make these type of arguments in the ideal and actual world. What makes debating possible in the ideal and actual world? Well, the first thing is we have to talk about what we do in debate, because in debate and argument we do a whole series of things. On the first level, it's pretty simple, right? We speak, we read, and we research, and these are all valuable tools to learn, and they make debating possible. We also engage in a rather significant form of types of organization. We have to take all this material and pull it together in some rational form in order to design the argument. But I think one of the areas that is undervalued is probably the psychology of debating, because what happens in the debate world is that you have individuals arguing against each other, often in a public forum at least, and what would end up happening is they are making arguments for which they are responsible. And that level of competition and that level of participation tends to produce a passion associated with the making of arguments that is often missing in the ideal and actual world. And one of the things we will learn is how to be passionate in the arguments we make. The hypothetical or psychological battle that exists on the argument and debate field is a way for us to provide information and to eventually get to kernels of truth, which then can be used to develop consensus in our society. What are the rules that make debate possible? Well, there's a lot of rules that make debate possible. We generally use pretty much two in policy debating, and they transfer quite adequately to the ideal and actual world. The first is the issue of presumption, that there is something that we use to countervalue something we refer to as the burden of proof. When we make an argument, one side of the argument would have less of a burden of proof than the other side, which pretty much means one side would have more presumption than the other side of the argument. When we say an argument has presumption, we're saying that it appears to be true on its face, and until we hear evidence to the contrary, we're probably going to believe it's true. And that rule has helped debate quite a bit, because what it does is manage the burdens of proof. In other words, someone who has the presumptive side of an argument has less of a burden, much less of a burden, than someone who is arguing against her. The second rule we have normally associated with debating is this issue of fiat, which is incredibly arbitrary, but in policy debating, we normally want to argue whether something should be done, not whether it will be done. And the reason is quite simple. We don't want to argue government policy will be adopted, because it pretty much can only be resolved if we survey government policymakers and ask them how they feel on policy, or if we end up researching their voting records. Now, there might be a reason to do this, which is desirable in the political science classroom, but it doesn't really contribute much to the teaching of argument. The teaching of argument is more easily accomplished if we somehow can short-circuit that process and just talk about whether something is a good idea or not a good idea, not whether it would happen or will not happen. And so in the debate world, we assume that the policy is adopted, and then we debate the costs and benefits associated with the adoption, or we debate the faults associated with the adoption, and assume that government policy is not going to be the direct focus of the debate. We're going to short-circuit the debate on whether we have enough Senate votes and whether we have enough votes in the House of Representatives to pass the proposal. In addition, we need to adopt fiat because, as you will learn in probably another lecture, we have certain stock issues in argumentation Two of those stock issues are inherency and solvency. The inherency stock issue says the present system won't do something, and the solvency stock issue says what's being advocated will work. Well, there is a conflict between the two, because if the present system never adopts it, it obviously is not going to work. So for that debate to occur, we generally give the side making the argument fiat. The side making the policy recommendation gets fiat. We assume the policy is adopted, and if the policy is adopted, then we can just talk about whether it's desirable or not, or whether it has intrinsic faults. The last thing which makes debate possible is the making of arguments. And the making of arguments may sound pretty self-evident, but what we tend to do in debate is make arguments that are based on extended chains of logic. In other words, we would say the affirmative policy option, for example, comprehensive health care legislation in the United States, might be related in turn to a dispute among physicians who would find this undesirable, which might be related in turn to how they might react to other government policies, which might be more desirable than the policy being advocated. We use extended causal chains or extended correlations or extended argument chains in order to make our arguments in debate round. Now, we all know that as the chain gets longer and longer, the reliability of the relationships decrease. But in debate, we tend to allow the debaters in the debate to use extended argument chains in order to make the arguments in a debate round, which makes the debates actually possible. So how do we use argument? We use it to resolve disputes, and we use it to literally make debate possible. And debate's made possible because of the roles we take in debate, the rules we use in debate, and the way we allow arguments to be constructed based upon extended causal chains.
Now let's talk about fallacies. One would wonder, why do we have to even talk about fallacies? And isn't it clear that there are fallacious arguments, that they don't make sense, that they're not valid? Well, I wish it was as easy as that. The reason we have this list of fallacies that are very useful for us to understand is that they may not be logically valid, but they sound good. They sound like they might be valid. And sometimes, to the uncritical listener, you can slip a fallacy through quite effectively. You don't want anyone to do that to you, and you probably want to avoid doing that if at all possible. So let's look at a list of fallacies. I've compiled a rather extensive list of fallacies, and I want to illustrate them by giving you an example from North American politics. Most of them come from American presidential politics of the 1980s and the 1990s. Let's just do them by number, shall we? Number one, hasty generalization. This is where you reach a generalization or a conclusion based on too few examples. Here's a sample argument that might do that. Wilson, Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, those presidents link up with World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Why, it's Democrats that lead us into war. That argument was made by Bob Dolan running for president. And of course, it's absolutely false. It wasn't a Democrat that caused the attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, they just happened to take place kind of at the same time. It didn't mean that there was any kind of causal agent. If you looked at all Democratic presidents and those who actively entered war, it would be significantly different. That's a hasty generalization. Type number two are called transfer fallacies. And there's a few different kinds of transfer fallacies. For example, there's the fallacy of composition. That's where you're saying what's true of the part must be true of the whole. Why, there was a Canadian election the other day, and I heard this comment. Canadians who voted Conservative want a trade agreement with the United States. Conservatives won the election, so all of Canada must want that trade agreement. No, you're mistaking what's true of the part is true of the whole. Maybe a majority of Canada wanted a trade agreement with the United States, but that doesn't mean that they all wanted it. There are also fallacies of division. What's true of the whole is true of the part. Here's an argument that's made about Democrats in the United States. Democrats are a more liberal party in America. Therefore, their candidate will be a liberal. It doesn't mean that just because as a whole the party tends to be more liberal, that necessarily their candidate will be a liberal. In fact, most of the Democratic candidates recently have been fairly centrist. because that's really where the undecided voters are. Just because the party is liberal doesn't mean that the candidate is liberal. Final transfer of fallacy I want to mention is the fallacy of refutation, also known as the straw man or straw person argument. This isn't where you really don't attack an argument that someone is making. You reconfigure it, you redescribe it as a weaker straw person, and then you beat up on it. Of course, it being easier to beat up on straw people than to beat up on, to fight real people. As in The Wizard of Oz, where the straw man said, "And then they threw my legs over there." I'll give you a good example from when George Bush ran for president against Michael Dukakis. He was heard to say things like this: "I'm not running against Michael Dukakis. I'm running against the liberal ideology. Liberalism means big government and high taxes. That's why you should vote against the liberal governor of Massachusetts, and you should elect Dan Quayle and I in 1988. Here, George Bush really wasn't engaging Michael Dukakis. He was reconfiguring Michael Dukakis as some sort of demon of liberalism and then attacking liberalism. He's not really attacking his opponent, he's attacking a straw person version of his opponent. The third kind of fallacy I want to mention are irrelevant arguments. These are called non sequiturs. They're things that just don't follow one from the other. For example, we could say that today is Wednesday, and therefore there is no food available today. There is no connection between Wednesday and food. Why would it be different? Or because it was warm, I decided that I would not go to school. There's no necessary connection between the weather and the school, unless, of course, there's a beach close by. All bad arguments, all fallacies are basically non sequiturs. The fourth fallacy is called circular reasoning. This is where your conclusion is merely a restatement of your claim. Oh, it's very effective and usually makes for a really good slogan. Like, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. So you just change guns. When guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. And of course, based on is just the second statement is just a restatement of the first. One critical difference, of course, the word outlaw means something different when it's talking about a process, a verb, a legal action, and outlaw being someone who disobeys the law. They're a couple of really different things. The fifth fallacy is just avoiding the issue. Some of these are pretty basic and commonly found in general political rhetoric. You refuse to answer arguments made by an opposing advocate. Or perhaps you would attack the person instead. I've heard it said, for example, George Bush is a rich Texas oil man, so he won't make decisions in the interests of the common person. Well, that's really attacking George Bush for, being born in Texas and being in the oil business. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's not interested in common people. That's an attack on him and his background. Another way to avoid the issue is to shift the ground and start talking about something else. Try to change the issue to something you'd rather talk about than something that your opponent has said. One of the most common ways of avoiding the issue is seizing on a trivial point, and in America we call this waving the red herring. That is, every time something comes up, you have the same thing that you say over and over and over again that isn't really necessarily about the point. For example, in the presidential election of 1988, the argument was made by the Republicans that Michael Dukakis had pardoned a black man who had committed a murder, Willie Horton, and they argued that the man who pardoned Willie Horton will not be an effective crime fighter. Every time Michael Dukakis would try to introduce domestic issues, they would wave this red herring, or in this case, rather racist example of the Willie Horton situation to try to ignore the real argument and bring up one that was very emotionally loaded that they could use all the time. traditionally in Western rhetoric, during the Cold War period, communism was used in this way. People would, any issue would come up, and then it would automatically be related to the global conflict between the East and the West, between capitalism and communism, and on every issue, this red herring, literally red, tended to be waved. Sometimes it was relevant, and sometimes it was completely irrelevant. And at that point, it was a fallacy. The sixth fallacy that I want to talk about is when you identify false dichotomies, things that aren't necessarily choices that you have to make. One of the classic lines from my youth is, will you bring your lunch or walk to school? Well, you don't have to choose between bringing your lunch or walking to school. A lot of times, advocates will try to frame their arguments as false dichotomies. You either have to agree with me or go down this path towards destruction, when of course there is another option. For example, the argument is made by Republicans in the United States that if the Democrats want to spend more on social programs, they will simply have to raise your taxes. Very common argument that has been made by Republicans against Democrats. But of course, that's a false dichotomy. There are other ways to get money. You don't have to just raise taxes. You could cut other programs. You could increase the debt. You could use the surplus. There are many different options. Be wary of fallacious arguments that try to present false dichotomies to you. Fallacy number 7 is when you appeal to ignorance. You appeal to ignorance. You appeal to something that can't be disproven. The failure to disprove something is not necessarily an example of proof. For example, it was said that Ronald Reagan met with space aliens in 1987, and you can't prove that he didn't. Well, the fact that I can't prove that he didn't doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that he did. Failure to disprove something proves nothing, and this is called an appeal to ignorance. The 8th example I want to give of a fallacy is appeal to the crowd. This is often known as the bandwagon effect. If other people are believing it, well, why shouldn't I? If other people are doing it, why shouldn't I? Now, of course, that's a fallacy because you probably should think for yourself. That's what this entire tape series is about. And don't let other opposing advocates try to get people onto some kind of bandwagon. For example, the argument is made that since either George Bush or Al Gore are going to win the presidency in the year 2000, voting for Ralph Nader would be throwing my vote away. Well, you may not be going along with people, but you might probably not throwing your vote away. Deciding to vote just on the basis of how other people are voting is probably a fallacy. Number 9, appeal to emotions. And of course, just appealing to emotions are no substitute for reasoning. Sometimes emotions will be used to cover up a lack of reasoning. Number 10, appeal to authority. It's nice that experts support your ideas, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily true. You need to demonstrate that for the audience and think for yourself. Number 11, appeal to tradition. Well, just because that's the way we've always done it doesn't mean that we have to keep doing it the same way. We gave women the vote. We did away with slavery. A lot of things that are traditional are now seen to be bad. Number 12, appeal to humor. It's nice to be funny. It's charming to be funny, but it's not a substitute for reasoning. Jokes may be useful in keeping the audience's attention, but they don't prove arguments. Number 13, ambiguity and equivocation. You can use some words in different ways to prove different things. For example, it's been said that if you want democracy, you need to vote for the Democratic Party. Well, just because their name is Demo CR something doesn't mean that they are necessarily in favor of democracy. The name isn't necessarily the thing itself. Language can be used in very slimy ways. Number 14, people can try to use technical jargon to fight bad reason, to hide bad reasoning, to hide bad examples and poor evidence. Be on the watch out for that and don't do it. Number 15, what is called the post hoc fallacy. The post hoc fallacy. That because one thing happened after another, then one thing must have caused another. That's not necessarily true at all. In fact, the argument's been then made that after Bill Clinton was elected president of the United States, the USA economy improved, so we should remember that when he runs for re-election in 1996. Well, just because the economy improved after he became president doesn't mean that it improved because he became president. Fallacy number 16, damning the origin of a specific idea. Even reprehensible people may have some good ideas, and just because someone comes from a particular background doesn't mean that the idea itself is necessarily bad. Number 17, wishful thinking. Hoping against hope that something will happen. You shouldn't decide to do something because you hope it can happen. You need to be realistic about it. Number 18, lip service, where you say one thing and do another. Very common among politicians who will claim something but not particularly carry it out. If you speak against someone several times, you can be on the watch out for that. Number 19, personification, taking an idea and making it seem like a person. When John Bull starts fighting with Uncle Sam, no such creatures exist. It's a fantasy. You can't make an argument about it. Number 20, cultural bias. Cultural bias. We need to understand that we come from a specific cultural perspective. The use of mustard in my culture might seem logical to me, but it doesn't seem logical to you. That doesn't mean that either one of us is inherently right or wrong. Number 21, pointing to another wrong. Sometimes this happens in personal arguments. You're talking about something and someone will say, oh yes, but don't forget, you forgot to wash the dishes last week. Or remember that you forgot to call me on New Year's Eve, 1991, and of course that has nothing to do with it. Pointing to another wrong does not answer that argument. Number 22, having nothing but objections. Just saying no, 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 no every time an opposing advocate says something doesn't mean you stand for anything. At some point, opposing advocates need to say more than no, they need to say what they are in favor of. 23rd, and finally, it's a fallacy to demand perfection in everything that your opponents do. Argument is a comparative thing where you're deciding who's doing better. And you can't necessarily demand that any argument be perfect. Don't argue that your position is perfect, but that it's better than the arguments of the other side. And that's a fallacy you should avoid. 23, quick fallacies. Watch out for them. Don't use them.
I'm here to discuss the issue of personal bias on the part of both the speaker and the audience, and how it affects a presentation and what one might do to account for it. Traditionally, there was a linear model associated with communication. There was a transmitter of information and a receiver of information, and information flowed in a direct and unbroken line from the transmitter, person A, to the recipient of the information, person B, or to a general audience. And over time that was discovered that was a fairly simplistic model of the communication process. That in fact communication involves the way in which listeners process information rather than passively receive it, that listeners do so in a particular context, and that there are always a lot of distractions and variables that are associated with human communication. Communication is a complex process. It does involve biases on the part of both speakers and audiences. One needs to account for them. Let me begin with the audience. And the reason that I'm beginning with the audience is that's what most speakers think is the troublesome element associated with making a presentation. That they must in some way account for or overcome the biases that are inherent in any audience. At the outset, I want to make a distinction between biases and prejudices. By bias, I simply mean that people hold opinions. They have active brain waves. They function on a regular basis, creating and disposing ideas. And so it is irrational for someone to believe that they will have an audience ready to receive any information that they present in the way in which they would like to present the information. All this information is going to be processed through the biases, the needs, beliefs, attitudes, knowledge bases of the audience, and they will vary considerably, and they'll be different in different contexts. And so one always has bias. It's more difficult to deal with the issue of prejudice. And prejudice might be defined as a bias that is so deeply held that one cannot actively listen to the information or presentation of another. It's very difficult for an individual to overcome prejudice during a presentation, but one can certainly account for bias. Some of the elements that I'll talk about in a moment might also work on individuals who are prejudiced in an audience, but they will not work in a short period of time. They might allow someone to persuade a prejudiced individual or a prejudiced audience over time, but there's never going to be an immediate connection between a speaker making a point to a prejudiced audience that is at odds with the way they view the world and that audience. It's important, though, to recognize at the outset that you must determine the differences among the audiences to whom you will make a presentation. Obviously, it's different if you're addressing leaders of a business community, primary education students, or debate judges. You would make different kinds of presentations to each of those kinds of audiences. But in each of these circumstances, I think there are four things that you'd like to do. First, you want to determine the purpose of your speech. Determine the purpose of your speech. Is it to change people's minds? Is it to reinforce ideas they already hold? Is it to compete successfully in an academic contest against other debaters? Is it to entertain the audience? You need to determine the purpose of your speech, and I think formally address that during your presentation. The caveat would be, I don't think I would tell people, now I'm going to try to entertain you, and then make an entertaining presentation. But it might be important to tell an audience that you're trying to convince them to move from a position that they hold to one that you think is more considered or reasonable or more effective for them. It might be important for you to reinforce behavior that you identify in an audience. And it might be important for you to tell a debate judge, here's why I'm winning the debate. These are the issues that are most salient and ought to be considered by you in evaluating the outcome of the debate. So you might want to formally address the purpose of the speech. Secondly, you need to select and narrow the topic for discussion. You actually want to create a context for understanding on the part of the audience. It's not appropriate to have generalizable discussion in any way meet the expectations or biases of an audience. It's necessary for you to define the topic in the way in which you want the audience to perceive your presentation. Interpretation of an issue is essential, and you could present the same information, for example, educational reform, to a debate judge, to educated students, even though they were much younger than yourself, or to leaders of a business community, but it would be a presentation that would be substantially different in each of those cases. And so you need to select and narrow the topic for the particular audience to actually create a context for the audience. Third, you need to develop core ideas. What few issues will you use as the foundation for your discussion? And I would focus on only 2 to 4 ideas in a standard speech that might last 7 to 10 minutes. Audiences cannot keep track of multiple ideas, and it's important to focus on the most germane and important or significant issues. You can develop larger themes associated with those issues, but you should focus them and then connect them to a larger theme. For example, you could talk about the elimination of the death penalty, but you would want to create larger themes that connected with ideas that an audience might have about the persecution of the innocent, or about the dangers of extreme state action, or about the value of rehabilitation and forgiveness. You would be arguing about the elimination of the death penalty, but you might be arguing about it in ways through thematic devices that would connect with information that the audience has. In addition, I think that it's important for you to organize your presentation to account for biases from the audience. That might mean that you should make multiple claims, any one of which might appeal to a member of the audience. Not every idea is going to appeal to everyone, but perhaps you only need them to convince them of one idea in order to make your point. You might want to raise objections and answer them. Raise the very kind of objections you anticipate that an audience might be raising about your speech as you present it. And you could do this in the form of rhetorical questions and then an appropriate answer. And you might want to try to provide negotiation devices or face-saving room in a presentation so that there's room for disagreement. Now, as for one's own bias, it's probably impossible to know oneself in a way to avoid the biases that one has in the expression of one's own ideas. But you might try to avoid egotism, meaning don't commit to your ideas. In other words, you need to be considerate of the other. This is a powerful ethical stance to take as well, but you need to be considerate about the fact that members of the audience might think differently about issues. You need to respect them. You shouldn't overreact to negative comments during a presentation. You should not jump to conclusions. Don't be defensive about ideas. Make sure that you give the impression that you're confident but open to information from other individuals. And you also want to examine the audience reaction and adapt to it. Be flexible in a presentation. It's not necessary for someone to be strident in order to get a point across. One can often accomplish the very same ends through the ability to adapt and reorganize information during the course of a presentation.
Practically speaking, what we often confront is a choice that we have to make. Should we make arguments that we know will appeal to this specific audience that we're talking to, or should we make arguments that we really believe in? Are we trying to take advantage of their beliefs and get them to go along with us, or are we really trying to find, reveal, and explore the truth? It's an age-old battle. It goes way back to classical Greece and the conflict between the sophists and the philosophers. And not only is it a classical construct, but it's also something that we confront every day. What should I do? Is it wrong for me to use arguments I believe that are weak just because they will work with this particular audience? One of the answers to this issue and this conundrum that has emerged is provided by continental European philosopher Chaim Perlman, who suggests that at points like this we might want to have a new construct that we use to help guide us and to answer this question. And so I want to conclude our discussion today of the practical uses of argument by talking about Perlman's conception of the universal audience. We should speak, he believes, to the universal audience. What is the universal audience? Well, the universal audience is a construct that is created in the mind of the speaker. You as the speaker create this construct, and we all have our own universal audience. The universal audience is a combination of the actual audience, the actual people that you're speaking to at that point, and all rational beings that are able to hear and judge the arguments that you're making. Example, here's my construct of the universal audience for this particular talk. My arguments need to be framed so as to persuade you, the viewers. But that's not enough. I'd also like to frame them for Professors Abramovich and Stojanovic, who are my colleagues at the Belgrade School of Law in Yugoslavia. and for my mentors in the United States, Professors Parson and Ziegemüller, and for the ghost of Aristotle and the ghost of Cicero who are lurking in the area, and all of my students at home at the University of Vermont, and, in fact, the entire universe of rational humans that I can imagine. So what you're called to do here is to construct for yourself a universal audience. You design for yourself a broad swath of what audience you want, but it always includes the actual audience, the people you're actually making the arguments to, as well as a constructed universal audience of as many rational beings that are interested and able to understand your argument that you might imagine. Well, let's say that you put this construct together, that you have created a universal audience. What are some guidelines for using this? In the practical situations you find yourself in, what are the guidelines for using the construct of the universal audience? Well, the first would be that you should not use any argument for the actual audience which the universal audience would reject. If there's an argument, let's say a biased and particular argument that might work with this actual audience, but you know it will be rejected by many important portions of the universal audience that you respect, then don't use it. What that means in many ways is don't use the specific biases of your audience. Now, you'll make a real-time decision whether to do that, but if you're using the construct of the universal audience, you should not. Second, do not use arguments with which the universal audience would allow and would like, but that the actual audience would reject. Right? The actual audience is specific. They are biased. And don't use any arguments that you think the ghost of Aristotle and Cicero would like, that you know that those human beings actually in front of you would reject. You need to make sure that the arguments you use work for both of them. It's a very tough task, but it's one really that finds an argumentative common ground, which may be more effective in the long run. So the second piece of advice, do not use arguments which other portions of your universal audience would like, but your actual audience would reject. Third, a real valid argument in this construct must gain the adherence of both. Must gain the adherence of both. You have to be in a situation where you think the arguments you use would work on everyone. So for a universal audience, you need to think of some universal arguments. Well, there are some implications of this which we need to understand for our practical use of argument. It is that you are deciding not to compromise your conception of what is good and right to merely sell vacuum cleaners or gain the vote or gain the short-term adherence of some biased and particular audience. That you have decided not to compromise yourself in their regard. But the other thing is, it means you can't just ignore them. You can't just decide that the actual audience are a bunch of turnip farmers who just came in from the country and know nothing. No, they are rational human beings. They may have specific preferences. They may have specific backgrounds. They may have specific levels of knowledge. They might not be up to what you term as your integrity level of argument, or those of the ghost of Aristotle or Cicero, for that matter, although Cicero could be a little loose with things. You have to respect every audience that you are actually presented to. You can't just speak over their heads as if you were making arguments to the gods of logic. You also must speak to those people who are actually there. So what happens is that your arguments need to become more universal. When you enter an argumentative situation as well, I think from this perspective, you risk your own convictions. You risk your own convictions. Practices like this and modes of analysis like this might indicate to you that you are one of those actual audiences, and that perhaps your perspective needs to be broadened, that you should be more representative of the universal audience of all rational beings capable and interested in making these decisions. It allows us to better understand that we need not be so fanatical about our ideas, that we might be incorrect, that there might be other points of view. It's the fanatic who says that he or she knows the ultimate truth, that their mind can't be changed. They say, there is one truth, I know it. But that does not mean that in this construct you should not reach out to audiences of fanatics. On the other hand, you may have the skeptics, where there's never enough proof, there's never enough logic, that nothing is true, who say that if nothing is true, everything is allowed. That's another kind of particular audience that you may be confronted with. And you must also avoid pandering to them in constructing a universal audience, one that is composed of all rational beings. You show universal argumentative respect. You won't use weak and dangerous arguments just because you know that audience would go for it. Nor do you ignore actual audiences and speak over their heads as if you were addressing only the gods of logic, of which you assume you must be one. You understand that we are a universal community of reasoning beings. And just because that actual audience may be biased in some way, that they're not totally reasonable and objective, does not mean that they do not belong to that universal community of rational beings. Because who of us can say that we are not biased, that we are not particular? We are all. We grow by trying to broaden our perspective and realize that we are all one of a universal audience which strives to be rational, which strives to be logical. And I think that that approach, although if you really need to sell vacuum cleaners, may not be one that you would use, it's one that you should always keep in mind, and it's something that we can strive for.